Live from York, this is the Late Late Show with Christopher Vowles on Teachers Talk Radio.
Good evening and welcome. Tonight we're joined by author, academic and zine enthusiast Dr. Jean Shepper as we think about zines as teaching tools. So join us as we explore the history of zines, connections between zines and protest, and students as zine makers.
Live from York, this is the Late Late Show with Christopher Vowles on Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live on the Podbean app or desktop player. Just head over to www.podbean.com/lsw/ttradio or search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Sunday Late Show. Today is the last weekend of my summer holiday and I'll soon be back at work to welcome new arrivals for academic year 24-25. I spent some time this holiday recharging in a tent in the rural isolation of mid-Devon in the week before the southwest had its really good weather, so I have now perfected the art of putting up a tent in the rain, assembling a family meal based on the contents of a campsite convenience store on a single hob burner, and negotiating the various craters and trenches that distinguish the A roads that link the village of Witheridge with Westward Ho on the North Devon coast, Exmouth on the southeast Devon coast, and Glastonbury over the border in Somerset. And this was all rounded off, of course, with a seemingly endless 12-hour drive back to North Yorkshire, behind what must have been every defective caravan west of Bristol, in time for my daughter to attend her international brownie jamboree early the next day. Fortunately, much of the teaching work for September was wrapped up at the end of last term, so I have had some time to catch up with private reading and fix various things around the house that only seemed to break in expensive ways during the summer. April may be the cruelest month, but surely August is the costliest, especially if you're looking to entertain primary-age children when the weather's bad. So since we last spoke, I've read 3 books that have given a shape to my holiday time. First was Tom Michel's memoir of his international boarding school teaching, The Penguin Lessons, in which he describes the life-changing experience of discovering and living with a rescue penguin that he had found on his way to Argentina, and the challenges he faced in combining this act of compassion with meeting the expectations of his boarding school employers. Second was William Atkins's personal nature writing study, The Moor, in which the author explores the topography, history, and modern uses of moorland in a variety of English regions, including Dartmoor, where I first learnt to hike camp with my Exeter-based scout group, and the North York Moors, which begin half a mile from my present front door, as well as some of the obscure strips of moorland that fall outside England's national parks. And third was Jarvis Cocker's Good Pop, Bad Pop, a sort of personal memoir hung on the social history of assorted ephemeral objects unearthed from Cocker's attic and revivified with anecdotes of how, where, and when they had been acquired, what influence they had, if any, upon the development of his early musical career with Pulp, and their wider significance as the bric-a-brac of late 20th century pop culture in Sheffield. As I sat to read these books and think about them afterwards, what occurred to me was the degree to which these 3 very different texts all seem to have a significant place for the work of the schoolroom. And the schoolroom came out in different ways in each of those accounts, but it was very much central to each of the texts. Most obviously, The Penguin Lessons offers a fascinating glimpse into the way international school teaching used to be in a post-Falklands Argentina, with its coups, economic crises, and cultural differences. There are some particularly entertaining moments as Atkins's penguin helps one particular student realise a talent for swimming that had, until one encounter with the penguin, gone largely unnoticed to the rest of the school. Surprisingly, The Moors opens with Atkins rediscovering some of his GCSE geography coursework on the moorland around his childhood home of Bishop Waltham. The aim of this inquiry, reports the adult Atkins, quoting his 14-year-old self, quote, will be to discover what the state of the moors will be in 20 years. Will it be the natural haven it is now, or will it be a landscape of red brick houses with no wetland and therefore no springs and no river Hamble? Or will the springs dry up without the construction of houses and be lost to the water authority? Atkins's GCSE inquiry came as a timely reminder to me that sometimes, just sometimes, the curriculum can support our students to do some big thinking on some important real-world questions. For Atkins was asking these questions as part of his Key Stage 4 geography studies in 1990, a time when the internet was in its initial stages of development, before the climate emergency movement had risen to prominence and before the Soviet Union had finally collapsed. I wonder how many of us have some old schoolwork sitting around in a box somewhere that might provide the springboard for a documentary account of some long-held but rarely acknowledged passion, or an engaging novel based on the people that were once a vital, reliable part of our lives, but from whom we have since been parted by death, or the simple, everyday circumstances of contemporary life. What was clear in Cocker's book, Good Pop, Bad Pop, was the extent to which his obsession with the music and fashion of the early, mid to late 70s framed his school days. His band members largely comprised people he met at school and at college. Pulp's first live gig was performed for his schoolmates in the hall during a lunchtime with the encouragement of his English teacher, and the doodles in his exercise books now seem to be important first drafts of Pulp's future style, attitude, and approach to musical creation. Cocker's book also features a number of the zines, flyers, and ticket stubs that testify to the DIY punk-inspired nature of the Sheffield music scene in the 80s and 90s. Our schools can be places of creativity, adventure, and engaging self-discovery. This is the lesson I will take back to the classroom with me next week. In the 8 weeks since my last show, of course, we have had a change of government, a new Prime Minister, a new Education Secretary, a new Schools Minister, and a new set of promises on how schools will be shaped for the future. Independent schools are bracing themselves for an earlier than anticipated cancellation of their 20% VAT exemption, a policy I understand is already posing some anxiety for a number of small, remote prep schools beyond the southeast. A task force has been established to address child poverty. A curriculum review has been announced. Further education teachers have missed out on the pay rise agreed for primary and secondary teachers, and the planned defunding of a number of BTEC subjects has been placed on hold until a review of this decision reports back by the end of December. We will wait and see what other plans the government has lined up for schools, colleges, and universities when the new term begins. In the midst of this change at the Department for Education, A-level and BTEC students have received their exam results, and aspiring undergraduates have been planning their first-year accommodation options, negotiating a route onto an attractive course through clearing, and applying for examination marking reviews where things haven't gone quite as they might have wished. My sixth form results day this year involved supporting students in each of these categories, but there will be more to say on this in the coming weeks, once the clearing window has finally shut. Universities this year certainly seem to be more on the ball than they were last year in dealing with queries from students with unusual admissions profiles, although their processes were probably not helped by the number of schools who seem to have been on the wrong end of some unprecedentedly savage history coursework moderation, as reported by Schools Week a few days ago. But in tonight's show, I'd like to focus on the topic of zines that I touched on in relation to my summer reading. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce Dr. Jean Shepper, who will be exploring this diverse and flexible medium with us, both as a record of cultural and subcultural activity, and as a space for students to express their own thoughts and feelings about the cultural moment they inhabit. So we'll be asking, who chooses to study zines and why? What might we expect to find in zines past and present? And how can zines be utilised as teaching tools in the university classroom? Dr. Jean Shepper, an associate professor at University of California, Irvine, has been teaching with zines in collaboration with librarians, museums, and community zine festivals for over 10 years. Jean is a devotee of bookstores, libraries, free little libraries, zines, public art, and creative acts of resistance. She has published in Radical Teacher, Feminist Studies, Feminist Media Studies, and other interdisciplinary journals, as well as creative outlets Shattered Wig Review, Lavender Review, and other anonymous adventures. She is the author of Moving Performances, Diva, Iconicity, and Remembering the Modern Stage, and the recently published edited volume The Spectre and the Speculative, Afterlives and Archives in the African Diaspora, with May G. Henderson and Jean Melton II. I'm delighted to say that Jean joins us on the line now from California. Good evening to you, Jean, and thank you for joining us on Teachers Talk Radio today.
Good evening, and thank you for that lovely introduction. And yes, I'm phoning in from Southern California, and it's good to be with you and your listeners. So thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for being with us. Perhaps it might help to begin, Jean, by asking about your own academic journey. How did you come to academic research and university teaching?
Yes, thank you. I grew up in Baltimore, and I went to my undergraduate education at Sarah Lawrence College. And I chose that at the time because I had no grades and no majors. So it was a very self-directed education, where for every class, and many of them were year long instead of semesters, you would design your own independent research. So I think that I've always had a passion for thinking in that multidisciplinary way. And there I studied literature, philosophy, and the visual arts. And so I was always interested in that intersection. That did take me to graduate school at University of Maryland, College Park, for where I did an MA in literature. And then I found myself at a kind of crossroads, not sure if I wanted to continue the PhD, and also trying to figure out what I wanted to study. So I took time off actually and worked at two different colleges of art, the Maryland Institute College of Art and the Massachusetts College of Art, doing college admissions work. And again, that was an opportunity to um, connect more with students who were creative, people, and to kind of explore the art scene. And after I left that, I did decide to go back and do a PhD again in literature at UC Santa Barbara. So that brought me to the West Coast. And I did an emphasis in feminist studies. So again, kind of continuing that multidisciplinary approach to what I was doing. And then I also did a postdoc in women's studies at University of Houston. So I've been in very different parts of the country, and exploring different cultures and communities within those spaces.
And what was it that brought you to the study of zines in particular, Jean?
Yeah, so I trace that back to this earlier moment in the 80s and 90s when I was coming out, as queer in that moment. And zines were really a part of both the music scenes and the queer, gay, and lesbian subcultures of that moment. And so for me, they're deeply associated with direct action because that's the era of HIV/AIDS activism in the face of government inaction, and and really widespread cultural homophobia. And so the zines were a way of both kind of, were deeply connected with direct action and also with formations of subcultures and, subcultural communities. So zines are very much about people being able to connect and find others, especially in a time when you're sort of under attack. And so for me, that's the entry point for zines. But they also are very much a space of celebration and, creating representations that you weren't seeing in the mainstream media, and so forth. So a lot of people, they associate zines with the punk movement or the riot girl, girls in punk movement. And that's that same era, actually, or a little later.
And were you actively involved in making those as you were moving through your student days?
Yeah, I was. I probably did something that was closer, and, zines have a kind of close cousin in the art, in art books, and handmade books and publications. So the zines I did were anonymous, and they were like, one of them I've written about is She Crab Soup. They were very small distribution, so I wasn't taking them to like the music concert like some people do and then, selling or distributing them. These were much more small run, maybe left anonymously in different spaces. But the work I was trying to do in them was through to kind of create new meanings through creative juxtaposition of uncanny images. So that's the thing I was really drawn to. Like, can we put things together in a new way to create new meanings? And so that was some of the early zines that I did. And then I
And were
also
there
was
any,
contributing, sorry, I was also contributing to, small press publications. Baltimore had a wonderful independent bookstore, Atomic Books, and Shattered Wig was one of the kind of literary zine type magazines that had a scene around it where they would hold poetry readings and so forth.
sorry, I was just going to ask actually about the
Yeah.
difference that you noticed between the zine scene, if that's a thing,
Yeah.
between the difference between Baltimore and California in that period.
Well, I came out to California much later, so I'd have to do something anachronistic and compare the two. I think now zines have had a kind of renaissance, right? And so what's very different now is that we have zine archives, zine festivals, digital archiving of zines, digital zines, right? We didn't have it. I'm talking about a period where zines were completely analog for the most part. And so there's a kind of rich abundance now, I think, in zine culture that you see. And so I don't think that's just California, but that's where I'm experiencing it.
And in terms of your academic research, Jean, what interests you most about zines? Is it the
Mhm.
zine as a product, a thing, or is it the zine as a vehicle for exploring particular values or identities?
Yeah. And I think, there is a connection of zines to my research in the early 20th century. And so where I was looking at the Harlem Renaissance, and you have like literary magazines like Fire that I think are kind of kin to the zine culture. But mostly zines for me has been about a pedagogical tool, which hopefully is of interest to your listeners. So for me, it's been really rich as just a classroom vehicle. And because I love archives so much, a lot of my classes, which I'll teach things like feminism and social change or queer knowledges, I'm taking students back to the past, to maybe the early 20th century, late 19th century, teaching them those histories of sexual culture, sexual minority culture, and identity, and then thinking about how that connects or is a kind of genealogy for the present. And so the zine can be a space where students can connect those kind of archival historical documents with the present. And I think the other thing I associate with it is when you go into archives, you're handling a lot of very ephemeral material, things that are, you know, precious. They're maybe one time, they're not, printed. There's something you can only see there, and they're very tactile. And those are qualities that I think you experience when you read zines, that they're very tactile. They can feel very precious, like little microcosms, the way an archive would feel. And so often I'm asking students to use the zine as like a mini curatorial project where they can create that conversation between the past and the present. And there's just also a lot of freedom in teaching with zines because students, I say to them, this is the ultimate space of freedom. There's no editor, there's no advertising, there's no, dictates, really, there's no rules. And so I think educationally, it allows students to kind of come in and bring themselves and bring their community into what they're making. And there's just a lot of freedom there for them to create the connections between maybe whatever subject matter you're teaching and how that subject matter would be important or meaningful for them.
How do your students respond to that? Because in the UK, we often find the experience of students, certainly from the ages about 14 upwards, can express quite conservative attitudes when they're being confronted with a document that is seemingly so outside of their own realm of experience. How do your students engage with those texts when they encounter them?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Actually, I was just looking in preparation for this conversation. I was looking back at one of the digital archives, which is QZAP, the Queer Zine Archive Project, and they have interns who come in. So they have a new intern this summer. And that intern was actually talking about, they weren't so much coming with conservative ideas, but they were coming in and saying, gosh, I'm finding stuff that really challenges my ideas, and I'm not even sure what to do with that. But I think the fact that they were even open to saying, I'm still going to go in, I'm still going to look at this material, document it, recognize it, even as it's challenging me. So that was just, that anecdote came up as you were asking that question. But I think for me in the classroom, you know, I, I'm not going to censor students and what they want to do with those zines. And I think almost like opening up the space in a generous way, to say, like, this is a space where you can wrestle or, work through these ideas, maybe is one way to address that. But I'm not naive in the sense that I tell students, like, zines, it's just a genre, let's say, or it's just a modality. And there are white supremacist zines, like there are zines that are doing all kinds of different cultural work. It's just that they tend to have a special place in progressive movements or activism, or as a space for people from what we would call marginalized identities, right? Because who aren't part of the dominant narrative, you can kind of find a space for telling that other narrative in zines. So I think you'd have to address that the way you would address it through anything else. I mean, I would love to ask you, like, how do you how do you address that kind of resistance? But I think students are actually excited once they get into it. I don't just do like one zine workshop. I what this some teachers call scaffold it through the class, so that they're spending that, we're on the quarter system, which is a 10-week system. They're spending that time, which is very quick, gathering materials, that becomes the raw materials they can work with. And then I try to really teach them not to be precious, in the sense of, you know be in conversation with your peers and me and develop these ideas, be willing to kind of like let them evolve and change, over the time of the quarter.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you make, particularly in relation to the issue around censorship. I mean, we sometimes get perhaps a distorted image of the censorship movement in the US over here in the
Mm,
UK. I think the UK academic uh, industry tends to think of itself as a bit more relaxed on censorship than the US, but I'm
mm.
not always sure that's true.
Well, I don't know. They're burning books in Florida here, so I do not want to understate the level of censorship. I think it's pretty profound. I was looking at images of, one of the schools in Florida. I think it was actually a college that was throwing out books, and it was very specific books they're throwing out. Right, they're throwing out ones they think come under the rubric of critical race theory, or they're throwing out LGBTQ studies. And in that pile, I definitely saw books that were part of my education, being dumped out. So I guess that's where I would take this kind of idea of teaching with zines, as a way to kind of fight that censorship, to draw attention to, materials that aren't going to be made accessible, because of those strains of censorship.
Yeah, it's interesting as well because in my school we were teaching 1984 as one of our exam
Right.
texts a couple of years ago, and I remember responding to one particular parental query who'd asked why we were studying poetry of death
Mm.
and the novel 1984 for exams. And one of the responses was, well, we don't get to choose the text, the exam board gets to choose the text. And the other one was because, well, actually, we think it sets them up quite well to study our tragedy course in year 12.
Hmm.
And we probably wouldn't ever study comedy as long as we're studying tragedy in year 12, so that our students have a sense of the kind of cultural context within which these texts operate. So, yeah, there is a sense that we do, even in UK schools, face resistance to some of the texts we set in front of students, even if we haven't made those choices ourselves.
Right, right. Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's been really interesting to hear about your personal journey into zine study and culture. Jean, what challenges do academic researchers face when they attempt to map and document a zine culture in America because it's an enormous country?
That's true. I mean, we have, like I said, in more recent years, like let's say the last 10 years, there's been these wonderful zine archive projects, and there's many of them. So there's the one I mentioned, the Queer Zine Archive Project, and then the university libraries like Barnard is one of them here in the California system, where we have um, people actually collecting zines. And at our own university, UC Irvine, the librarians started that collection to start collecting as part of their Orange County history, which is like our specific county that we're in. And then it began to expand. So I think there's a wonderful kind of connection between, collecting the local and then seeing how the local connects to the global. So now I think there's kind of a proliferation almost of material out there through these digital archives. And so the digital archives both are repositories of actual digital zines, but they're also taking the paper zines and digitizing them, or they're creating finding guides that tell you like what's in a collection if you can kind of get to that collection. So I don't really see, I mean, if there's an impasse, it's just that like not everything's included there. There's just zine culture can be very, very hyper local. So I think it's the challenge would be just kind of figuring out how you might continue to document the many different kinds of zines that are out there and how they're tied to different communities and cultures. But really, I think there's just a lot out there from which we can do more work. We can do more writing and analysis and sharing.
Yeah, I almost wonder if there's that archivist's anxiety that you've perhaps missed something.
Yeah, you're not going to get everything. So you definitely have to let go of that. I think it's, rather than thinking of trying to be comprehensive, I think it would be more trying to understand the role of zines within particular contexts. So actually, the reason I did reintroduce it into my teaching was because of a particular art show that came to our county, to the Orange County Museum of Art, called Alien She, and it was about the Riot Girl movement. And they did a wonderful job in that museum exhibit of presenting a whole zine, a whole zine wall. And they reproduced some of the really famous zines from that 90s, music scene. And so because my students had access, and I really love those moments when you can bring our students into the community. So I was able to have students go to the museum, experience that, and then see that, zine culture kind of reproduced in that museum exhibit. So it started from that kind of local, like what was available to me locally, and then sort of grew from there. And then our librarians decided they wanted to do an actual zine festival on our campus. And I thought that was really wonderful because it brought students again out of the classroom, meeting in the square in front of the library, and they brought community folks and they brought people from different disciplines. So we're a very science heavy campus. And so it was really great to sit there and make things with, people in the sciences, people in the humanities, people in drama and the arts. And so you get that lovely mix.
Yeah, and I expect that energy that you would experience as you take rather like taking a student from reading a play in the classroom out into the theatre to see it in action.
Right.
This sense that it's a kind of lived experience as much as anything else.
Yeah, exactly. And we have, again, some really wonderful independent bookstores, and they are now hosting like book fairs and zine festivals that our students could go to and connect with. And our students don't always do that. So this is a way to kind of encourage them to do that, to be out in the community.
Sounds like a wonderful experience, particularly if you get some good weather on campus and people are moving about from place to place. A
Yes.
really kind of dynamic experience. It's been really interesting to hear about your influences that have brought you to this particular discipline and the interdisciplinary work that stemmed from it. In the second part of the show, I'd like us to look a little bit more closely at the history and material nature of zines themselves, and consider how these evolved during the 20th century into the products that are made today, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we'll be right back after this.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Get set for the year ahead with the Bloomsbury Education Back to School sale. Save 30% on all Bloomsbury education books until 30th September. From the very best in research-led practice to trusted advice on inclusivity, behaviour and curriculum design, we've got something for everyone. Visit bloomsbury.com/B2S sale to shop now and save 30%. Bloomsbury Education, books for every step of your teaching journey.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Media outlets across England, Wales and Northern Ireland have covered GCSE and other Level 2 results in detail. Many stories highlighted the fact that Year 11 pupils receiving results this summer started Year 7 in September 2019, but were in lockdown before the first year of secondary school had ended, with the BBC describing the cohort as unique. Many stories focused on the GCSE pass rate, which has fallen for a third year running, back in line with 2019 levels. The drop was steepest in Northern Ireland, followed by Wales. In England, the plan was to bring grades back in line last year, but they remained a little higher. The regional divide continues to grow in England. London continues to be the highest performing region, with 72.5% of entries marked at grade 4 or above, compared to the 63.1% in the West Midlands. The gap is up from 8.7 last year to 9.4 percentage points. It seems the pre-COVID north-south divide is continuing. 4 out of 5 regions in the North and Midlands had a lower pass rate this year than in 2019. But in every region in the south it has risen. Many have commented that long-term disadvantages within some regions are to blame. MPs warned last year that it could take a decade for the gap between disadvantaged pupils and others to narrow to pre-pandemic levels. Resits are also set to rise for both English language and maths. This is because the pass rate is slightly worse, but the 16-year-old population has grown since the pandemic, so more places on courses to resit will be needed. Colleges have previously said they had increased class sizes due to population growth and grade boundary changes, but will now need to prepare for even more. This has prompted some to question whether the compulsory resit approach is still appropriate. Full details of the results analysis can be found on the BBC, TES and other education news websites. In Australia, the right to disconnect is coming into force. It gives employees the power to not respond to out-of-hours contact from their employer without suffering consequences. This has prompted some to consider the impact this could have on schools. While some legitimate out-of-hours activities have to take place, residential trips, visits and sport, etc., teacher unions have argued that staff should not be permanently on call. They have particularly focused on parent and student contact with teachers, especially via email, and the expected response times, which should be in place in order to protect work-life balance. The news from Australia has prompted fresh debate on social media regarding workload for teachers in many countries, use of emails, and the recruitment and retention crisis in the UK. The Guardian focuses on the story of a group of trainee female doctors from Afghanistan who have travelled to Edinburgh to complete their medical degrees after the Taliban forced them to quit. The 19 women arrived in the UK last week after a 3-year campaign by the parents of Linda Norgrove, the kidnapped Scottish charity worker who was killed during a rescue attempt by US Special Forces in 2010. A foundation set up by her parents worked with UK and Scottish officials to arrange safe passage and student visas. They have been given places at 4 medical schools after Scottish ministers changed the law to treat them as home students, eligible for free tuition. One of the women arriving said, "Our journey here will be long, 8 or 9 years. I think during this time many alterations and changes will come to Afghanistan. I am hopeful the situation won't remain the same." Finally, a primary school in Orkney has welcomed a new, unusual intake of pupils. According to the story on the BBC News website, the new class is made up entirely of boys. The rare occurrence is a first for the P1 class teachers, but the situation doesn't seem to bother the boys themselves, with one of the 18 saying the class was good without girls. The school is making sure that the boys will still have the opportunity to interact with girls outside the classroom, but that the boys-only class was really special and something they're going to remember forever. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
Well, welcome back to our show on zines and zine making with author, academic and zine maker Dr. Jean Schepper. In the first section of the show, we learnt about Jean's interest in zines and the fascinating role that these have played in her academic research. Now, we probably need to do a bit of thinking about what we mean when we talk about a zine. So, Jean, could you please tell us what we should understand a zine to be and how we might recognize one?
Yes, good question. So I think of zines as small, handmade, do-it-yourself, low-cost, low-circulation publications, right? Which still could fit with a lot of, different things under that umbrella. So there's actually a very traditional sort of iconic zine for those listeners who maybe are just coming to this, which is where you take a single sheet of paper that can fit in a standard copier and you fold it into in half and then half again and then half again. So you get the 8 pages of a traditional zine. And as I remind my students, there's a reason that that's the iconic zine. And it's because once you've completed your design and your information, your words, your text, your images, whatever you're using, then you can just lay that on a copy machine and make 300 copies. And the only thing left to do is fold. And so basically a zine is an unbound book. So there's no binding necessary. So those things, that like do-it-yourself element, keeping it very simple, that's your traditional zine. And then what you do with it is what you do with it. And I think that idea of something that's unbound is also a metaphor for that freedom I was talking about earlier, about sort of freedom of content within the zine. So that's the most, again, iconic kind of zine. But then when you move away from that, you get different ways of folding it, different ways where people do bind it. And so, yeah, one conversation we could have is like, to what degree is this kind of self-publication an extension of, other kinds of print culture, that we associate with an earlier time. So I mentioned Riker earlier, and a lot of people associating zines with like the punk movement. But there's also a genealogy that traces it back to the 30s to the science fiction fan zine. So that's where zine is short for magazine. And it came out of these fan cultures, science fiction fan cultures. But then you also have some scholars and feminist scholars who would trace it back even earlier to when you had, feminist pamphlets, right? And that's, of course, a much longer arc that we could talk about. So I like to think about all of those genealogies as I think about zines.
Yeah, I wonder what they would have looked like then before the photocopier became as widespread as it was.
Mm. Yeah. So I think it would be, I think of those like um, those small print runs, that we think of. So it would look like, some of the manifestos that were published, in the 19th century, or like the one I was mentioning from the Harlem Renaissance, Fire, which you can get, replications of. And it's like it is almost 8.5 by 11, but it's got a fancier paper as the cover, right? And a simple binding. And people were using different forms of printmaking, right, for the images and illustrations. So yeah, the question is that, how how much does that have an affinity with what we think of as zines? Because it's a little bit more refined, I guess, in that production that you're talking about.
It is quite diverse, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Because on the one hand, I have in my head an image of a kind of 1890s Art Deco style hand-drawn thing. And at the other end of the spectrum, I've got this kind of punk scruffy thing that may well have been stapled and glued in 15 different places to make it fit on the copier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I remember when I was in the archives working on the first book, which was Performance Cultures in the early 20th century. One of the interesting things that I found in there was people were really scrapbookers. And so they would create these scrapbooks that had like the tickets of theater they had gone to, menus and things like that. And I almost feel like those scrapbooks are closer in that sense um, to the zine, right? Because it's less polished and it's got that sort of ephemeral quality to it. And it's very personal. I think we haven't talked about the sort of public intimacy of the zine, but I think that's a quality many people experience when they pick up a zine. It feels like a little window into something very, very personal that maybe you shouldn't be looking at, and the scrapbooks, I guess, had that same feeling. That's what the connection I'm making.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask, and again, there may be, I imagine, multiple answers to this question, but what in your experience typically motivated 20th century zine makers to start producing them? If we go back to the turn of the century and then maybe think about the post-war period after that, what was it that were motivating people to have to put these things into print? Because it was relatively common for people to publish their own books relatively early in the 20th century before the big publishing houses took on that role.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the ones that, I think about, maybe I'll just go back to Fire, because that name was meant to kind of be an incendiary name that like we're a younger generation that's going to, do something fierce and, distance ourselves from, a different conservative past. So they were bringing into print, right, more vernacular writing or topics such as homosexuality that weren't being, allowed in more official organs, right? So there's that. And then I think, again, if you think about like the feminist broadsheets or manifestos, then what you're doing is having things that are connected to activist cultures and that, again, are important to like distribute quickly and fast and have a political agenda, right? And they're not being produced as something that isn't going to end up in an archive. They're being produced much more like on the fly, on the run, right, with that type of purpose. But I know this is also one of your areas. So what links do you see or what differences do you see in the little magazine cultures that you've looked at?
Well, it's interesting because the period I was focusing on when I was a postgraduate student was the period after the Second World War, both in the UK and in Ireland, and to some degree in America too, because one of the magazines I was looking at had a number of writers who were based in America, and quite a lot of the stuff that came out in the 60s and 70s was focused on the kind of anti-Vietnam War movement, the kind of CND movement, early elements of the Green movement, although they hadn't quite taken that formulation at that point. And it was really quite interesting looking at a British reader's view of a British editor's view of an American's view of America. at that time. Looking at some of the satirical stuff that appeared around about that time, Ralph Steadman was one of the artist contributors to the magazine. So, real sense of a magazine being motivated by a kind of political, not necessarily political agenda, but certainly political critiques of what they saw going on in the world around them.
Yeah,
How
absolutely.
close does that come to your zine experience?
Yeah, no, I think that's very close. I think that zines really have a special place in the language of critique and social critique. And, I also think there's a connection to things like, people having to found presses like Kitchen Table Press, because Black women authors and women of color were not getting published in the traditional publishing industry. So I think, there's a connection to that. So when I'm thinking about what they pull out of the archives when my students go visit, and that's one of the things they pull out, or they pull out, a portfolio of, feminist self-publishing that's sharing health information, right, in the 70s. Even something like the famous Our Bodies, Ourselves comes out of that kind of the work of a collective, right, that sees a need that's not being met, and then produces their own information and material. And that's, that was the spirit of that sort of militant 80s I was talking about too, which is that people, couldn't get information about HIV, AIDS, couldn't get information about what then we would call safe sex and so forth. And so some of the production of materials was about lay people taking on the role of educating each other about health, right? And risk. And for me, that's connected also to kind of like critiquing what you're talking about, like sort of mainstream political movements and so forth.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I wonder if the zine makers and the editors, if they're looking to educate a wider public, are kind of held back by the circles and networks within which these zines circulate. Is that something that is sometimes a problem? This need to wish, or this wish to get your message out to a wider readership, and that wider readership probably won't be the same people who are making your zines.
I think zines are often talking, to us. Okay, so in a way, they're talking to a smaller, or a more particular, not smaller, a more particular network. But that network could be quite wide, or it could cross, could still cross boundaries pretty far. So it's not mass distribution, but it is, interesting networks of distribution that could still become transnational or global and so forth, if that makes sense. So it's that kind of combination. But I think with the digital, of course, we solve this problem so that if you want that, you actually can take this smaller, more local thing and have a completely public, and wide distribution through the digital. So I don't know. I don't know if I see it. I don't know if it's a problem or not. Maybe that's like a social movement question too, because of course mobilizing numbers is important. But I think doing the work locally does have a wave effect, I guess, in terms of like it can produce that larger social movement. So I did a lot of visual culture activism with the union when the TAs in the University of California system were organizing. And that was a 15-year battle, by the way. So I was a part of the battle before the union even got recognition. So we were seeking, legal recognition for our union. And so we did a lot of posters. Political posters are kind of akin of the zine as well, and so forth, to kind of educate, first educate other TAs, right, about the working conditions, and then move past that to kind of educate a public about like why our working conditions are connected to students' learning conditions. So that's what I mean about that kind of exponential sort of growth of a message. It moves out, and that's kind of part of an organizing strategy as well, I think.
Yeah, I think you might be right. I've always been interested in this idea of how influence is felt. And sometimes it can be quite subtle. And it's the extent of those connections. So it's essentially the width of the second, third, fourth, and fifth rings of the network that really start to have the effect as you start to move from perhaps a minority idea to an idea that takes plays a wider role in the culture or society to affect a movement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. That kind of rippling of information.
And I wonder if we've now sped that up as we've moved online. It seems to be that we see evidence of that sometimes.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, I I'm struggling too with like, and this is, I was thinking about you were talking about conservative ideas in the classroom earlier, and I think I do struggle with like how to talk to students about, fake news, right? Or the manufacture. So with that speed, of reaching many, many people, we also have a speed up of misinformation as well. And so, you know, even while I laud the idea that like the zine is so free as a space and there's no editor, there's no, whatever, then that also makes it a space for, how has information been vetted and so forth. So it becomes a complicated and a good conversation to have in the classroom. So we talk about, different forms of copyright, and we talk about different ethics and politics of citation to use within zines, because they don't have the same requirements for that citational practice. So then it's something that you have to really bring to it as the maker.
I suppose there's also a question about free speech, isn't there, that goes right to the heart of what the zine maker's role is?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, I think it's the ultimate vehicle for that. But then that also, requires levels of ethics and responsibility that you bring, again, as the maker of this microcosm.
Indeed, and again, I speak to many American friends, and again, it's interesting the difference in how the UK and the US view free speech, certainly once you go to the point of writing it down and circulating it. How does that conversation occur in your particular context?
Well, it's almost enough for another broadcast episode because it's so complicated right now. We start back in October, and when we ended in the spring, I will be honest, and you may have seen it on the news or not, but we had a shocking militarized response to a peaceful protest encampment protesting the genocide in Gaza on our campus. And our campus called over 50 different police forces to campus. So, we're in this quite 1984 moment where we've prided ourselves on being a free speech campus, but also are now, creating rules and mechanisms and militarized response that don't meet that value, right, that we're purporting to have. So it's a very, very hard time in the US, I think, on college campuses right now.
And how do your students feel about that?
I think we haven't gone back to school yet, so I'm curious what the fall is going to look like. But, people were horrified by what happened on our campus and then at UCLA as well. And so we're still kind of in the midst of even figuring out how to respond to this new, climate. Yeah, it was a terrible. I felt like it was a very powerful betrayal of our mission as a public university.
Okay, so I imagine there'll be some quite complicated conversations going on once you are back.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, we'll be in the middle of an election, a very contested election cycle, where we have one candidate that wants to completely disband the Department of Education, and another candidate and their running mate who's, doing work like putting tampons in the bathrooms of the public schools. So two very, very different visions of what the role of public education is.
So will you find yourself under any particular constraints once the election draws to a close?
I actually am going to have a very interesting experience because we have a program at our university that where students go to DC, Washington, DC, and they live, work, study, and do internships. And I'm going to be teaching in that program, and I'll be in DC for the election. So I'm looking forward to it. I think it'll be just a very good time to be in conversation with our students.
I think it's a very good way of putting it. And in terms of the students themselves, are there any particularly important student-produced zines that our listeners ought to know about?
Well, I think I would more point people to the different archives that are out there so that you can explore and look. Like, it's hard to recommend an individual zine. There's some historically significant ones, like for feminists, there's Shotgun Seamstress is a famous zine, or Bamboo Girl, and you can find those in the archives. And again, Barnard University has a great feminist zine collection. QZAP has queer zines. For the California system, you can search something called the Online Archive of California. And if you just type in zines, you'll see a whole slew of different collections at different California universities. So I just think exploring is the best thing. But I have, zines that have really stood out to me from my own students' productions that are very moving and meaningful. One of them was a student who was in drama as an undergrad, and there was a PhD student who was a playwright and a TA and so forth. And so this undergraduate wanted to write about this graduate student's work because they were doing incredible work to produce plays and challenge the kind of Eurocentrism of our drama department. So when they conceived of their zine, they came up with it. If you can imagine the playbill you go when you go to the theater that says playbill, and it's got like the little yellow strip. I don't know. They're very like iconic here, at least in the US. So this looks just like that playbill you would get at the theater, but it's called What Did Jay Do? A zine by Lily Jackson. And then it incorporated like interviews and then discussions of the plays that this person produced and the kind of intervention that made, right? And anti-Blackness at our university. And it's both a well-conceived zine because of that concept of doing it like a playbill, but also I treasure that zine because this undergraduate student went on to found their own theater company and write plays and is very accomplished. And I just can see, how this was part of that journey. So that's very moving to me. And also it becomes this really important historical document because all my students, I invite them to donate their zines to special collections at the university. And so again, it's telling a story that might not be told in the official archives, but it gets to be archived and kept and remembered through our special collections collecting of student zines. So that's one. There are many others. I have students who work on, again, I encourage them to sort of follow their own path. So a lot of them, have a lot of undocumented students. And they also, because I'm teaching queer studies, I have a lot of what we call undocu-queer students. And so they are interested in, either researching history of what are the queer communities in Mexico and how can I bring that information and knowledge to my family here to help them understand my identity, right? So I think there's just a lot of moving work that my students are doing, again, to connect their education to their home spaces that might not have a space otherwise without a project like the Zine Project that invites that level of openness, if that makes sense.
I think so. It certainly sounds like you've got a very engaging and dynamic system up and running there, or scene, I suppose, up and running there. It's really, really quite cheering to hear. This playbill zine, was it a traditional 8-page zine?
That one actually, that's interesting that you asked that. So that one was not. That was one where we had to talk about doing more of I think I'm just looking at it now. There's 4 pages of a kind of 8.5 by 11 or close to it that are just folded in half. So there's still no binding, but that is a little more work to kind of, combine those and fold them. Not a lot more work, but so yeah, it's not the single sheet. One of my favorite single sheet zines, that traditional iconic one, was a student who decided they wanted to talk about let's call it hegemonic language, and then alternatives to that language in terms of gender and sexuality. And so they did a 2-sided zine because that's a clever thing you can do with that traditional format. So one way it was folded, you got all of the kind of mainstream definitions, and then you flipped it and you got all of the sort of counter definitions on the other side. And so they had a 2-for-1 in that zine.
I've often said to my colleagues that a blank A3 sheet of paper, as we call them here, is the greatest unacknowledged teaching resource in the world. And it sounds like, from what we've heard there, that we've got some more evidence stacking up.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, it's great to hear about that particular experience, and it's good that you've enlightened our listeners a little bit more about the history of the zine. Jean, in the final section of the show, we will consider how you use it in your teaching, more particularly, and the project that you've been involved with, the Crossing Pride project with migrants and asylum seekers. And I hope we're going to be joined by your colleague, Dr. Debanuj Dasgupta. Have I said his name correctly?
Yes, you have. I think, unfortunately, I just heard from them and they are going to have trouble joining us, but I can still speak to our collaboration and, hopefully at another point people can hear from them.
Okay, well, we'll explore some of the more detailed implications about what happens in your zine workshops then and the nature of this collaborative project.
Okay.
And we'll be right back after this.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Get set for the year ahead with the Bloomsbury Education Back to School sale. Save 30% on all Bloomsbury education books until 30th September. From the very best in research-led practice to trusted advice on inclusivity, behaviour and curriculum design, we've got something for everyone. Visit bloomsbury.com/B2S sale to shop now and save 30%. Bloomsbury Education, books for every step of your teaching journey.
Well, welcome back to the final part of our show on teaching with zines with Dr. Jean Schepper. So far, we have heard about the origins of Jean's interest in this wonderfully diverse medium and about how zines developed during the 20th century as creative spaces for often marginalised social groups and protest movements. In the final part of the show, we will look at what working with zines can bring to the educational experience in the classroom, the workshop, and beyond. And we might also have a look at your collaborative work, Jean, that you've been involved with too, with asylum seekers and refugees. But before we do that, could you please tell our listeners what you regard as the primary benefits that zine making can bring to the educational experience?
Okay, thank you. So I think we've touched on them, but we can kind of maybe hone in on them a bit. So I think that they do encourage students to make connections between classroom material and then whatever passions, questions, interests, or connections to their own community, they can bring into that conversation. So I think zines put them in conversation with the material in a different kind of way, in a way that encourages student ownership of ideas. So that's, I think, one. And I think it's a kind of space for dialogue. So I think it's a very dialogic kind of space as well for students to take, both dialogic with the material they're studying, but also between each other, because the idea of the zine too is to share it, right? And to be in conversation and to have maybe a purpose. So if you're not just sharing it with your peers, but maybe you're making a zine that, like, I think we had talked at another time about, I had a student who made a zine because she wanted to do a feminist guide to children's literature in the library. So maybe you have a purpose like that. And so she made this zine in my class, but then she actually took it to the local library and shared it with them as a resource. So you can create, actual community-based resources, or maybe you want to do, archiving of particular ideas, or again, communities' identities that might not be in the official archive. So when I've written about zines in the past and teaching, one of the ways that I kind of implemented it was to think of 5, I think it is, principles that for me are really at work in zines. So the first one was this idea of repurposed productivity. And I think of that as like stealing back your time from capitalism, from wage labor. So I think zines can kind of offer that promise a bit. And so for students, it's like getting away from the banking idea of education and really thinking about trying to encourage them to think about what is their own drive, with their own investment in their education. And then the second one was critical recycling, this idea that it's a space for taking ideas and reworking them, molding them. I think of clay, like molding it into the shapes that you want, molding it to the ideas that you want to get across. The third is that it's a space of anti-copyright. So again, we talked a little bit about that. These little publications are not copyrighted. And I teach students actually Creative Commons licensing. I don't know how much that's a big thing anywhere else, but our librarians really introduced me to that. And it was really wonderful because that gives students control over how they would want, if they want to use copyright, how they would want to use it. And Creative Commons licensing allows you to say, like, you know what, you can reproduce this whole thing without my permission, or you can reproduce this as long as it's for nonprofit, so you can have all these different sort of levels of copyright. So it's a really interesting space for talking about ownership of ideas, right? And sometimes I usually work in that question of like the politics of citation as well. And then the fourth would be world making. Again, these are spaces of possibility. So I find that it's just a place for nurturing imagination. And especially for queer subjects, that term world making is very important, like queer world making, like Jose Munoz and other scholars have talked about it. Zines offer that space for imagining something that you're often being told doesn't exist or is shameful or, is illegal, and so you've been given this space where you can imagine something different for yourself and you can imagine a future. And then the final one is this idea that you're joining in a very community-based project. So DIY skill sharing or do-it-yourself skill sharing becomes a part of it. So when I'm teaching students, I'm often learning from them, first of all, of course, all the time, because now there's a bigger generation gap and they have so much information about pop culture and about their communities that I might not have. So I'm always learning and adapting my syllabi in that conversation with them. But then I'm encouraging them to say, okay, you've actually learned this tool for expression and self-publication and so forth. And so now it's kind of you take that responsibility and pass it on, right? So that becomes a kind of ethics of passing along information and knowledge. So those are sort of these 5 principles that have driven like how I teach the zines. And then there's, of course, the more practical. I could talk about the more practical kind of workshop-y aspects of it if you want.
Well, one thing I was going to ask you, because you used the wonderful phrase earlier on in the first part of the show, this idea of zine making as being associated with a kind of feeling of public intimacy. Mm-hmm. How do you manage that in the context of your workshop scenario?
Yeah, I think first of all, having a conversation with students always in the classroom where you're inviting them to do self-reflective work so that they have a lot of control over that. So they know that, like, okay, these are the things that I'm going to be sharing with the class, and maybe I'm making some other stuff that I don't want to share with the class. So they have to think about that. But overall, I think, we do talk a lot about, so not just the ethics of citation, but like the ethics of listening, right? And the sort of responsibility we have when we hold someone else's knowledge and life that they're sharing with us. So I think students do have to learn a politics of care, for each other in the classroom. And so that can be part of the conversation as well. Because often zines do invite that kind of intimacy, maybe because we don't have always spaces for that, because even if we think about the sort of digital analogs of zines, which would be like certain kinds of social media, Instagram or TikTok, you're still, and a lot of that people are sharing very, very personal things, and it's so public and it's so out there. But it's a little different than the zine kind of sharing. So I don't know, that's just more of a question.
It is, isn't it? Although quite often I think of social media as being a space in which the making happens relatively in a relatively solitary way, but the effects of that solitary making go far beyond the room in
Right.
which it's being made. Whereas
Hmm.
when I'm thinking of zine workshops, I'm thinking of groups of people sitting around a table,
Hmm.
hands stretching out for the same materials, perhaps from time to time. How do you set up
Right.
your workshop space when your students are making?
Yeah, thank you. So like I said, I scaffolded it throughout the quarter so that they have, they're gathering materials. But then we do what's like a proper zine workshop, where I like to create tables where it really depends on what you have resources for, right? But we do have some spaces I can find here where you can get a long table where you seat like four people at each table. And so there's a collective of materials, right? And the basics would just be scissors and glue sticks, right? But I'll also make sure there's stacks of interesting and different kinds of magazines and other sorts of raw material. And then students are bringing some of their own materials that they've been collecting over the quarter, and I encourage them to share with each other. And then I think the most effective workshops, you kind of help people stage it a bit, and you give them some tools. So I think I mentioned one of them before, like creative juxtaposition. So I'll tell them, stop and try to find, you know, um, contrasting images, right? Or things like that. Or I'll say stop and only work with letters for a while and not images. And so I think creating those enabling constraints can kind of help a workshop move along. And then usually I go around and just talk with people one on one and do a version of what art school folks would call like a critique or crit, where we're just kind of bouncing ideas off of each other. So some people, sometimes students have their own, like each class has its own personality. So sometimes I've invited people to create a playlist and they've got their music going. Other times you have people who are like working in silence. Other people are very, very social. So you get all of that in the workshop space. But I think the main thing is, in a workshop space, you have that you're making, again, in conversation with other people. So there's like a kind of collective input into what you're doing. You can bounce ideas off of each other and so forth.
And how do you handle the presentation phase once this product has been made?
You have a zine festival. so so at the end we have a zine festival. It's quite fun, the last day of class, where I have like a laundry line where students, who want to, can hang their zine. So the zines are hung all over the room. And then I actually break my students, and this, there's many different ways to do this, but this I've found fun, is I break the students into two groups. So I'll do it over 2 days. And the first day, there's one set of makers who are presenting and the other set is listening. And then, the next day we swap it. And then they're in small groups and they present their zine. So they have like very short, give 2-3 minute presentations. And usually students are really rapt listening to each other around this. And then once all those presentations have taken place, then we put the zines out like a buffet. And I've asked them to bring enough copies for everybody. And so people go and pick up a copy of their zine. So you've got all those elements, right, of sharing, of distributing, right, and displaying the zines in the zine festival. So it's a lot of fun.
And they'll have a life, of course, if they've been picked up by a new reader and taken away.
Mm-hmm.
They'll have a different life if they've gone into the archives. But what other kinds of lives do these zines have with these students afterwards, once they've gone into the archive or left the workshop room? How do they continue to live on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, yeah, so some choose to leave them in the archive and become immortal. Others, like I said, they might have had a particular purpose for their zine. Like I had a student who was struggling with like reconciling Catholicism and their sexuality, and they made a zine about it and they shared that with their family. So that was like again, it had a kind of personal project there. Other folks, have a more, have a project of like, for instance, some kind of health education. I have a lot of students who go on to be doctors, nurses, and so forth. And so one who wanted to like educate like medical practitioners about menstruation and ways to talk about with young people about menstruation. And so then, I said, please go give your zine out at the, at the medical school. So So some of them have that kind of practical plan. I keep an archive, myself, and then I share it with the next group. So there's a kind of sense of continuity, like across my classes over the years, that I like to share with them. And then, I've invited, I had a student during COVID. So we were doing all the zine workshops virtually, and had never met in person, but ended up having that person come back as like a research assistant and work with me on the article that I was finishing up on zine pedagogy. And so they had done a zine originally that, again, was kind of personal, and they had come up with an interesting concept for it where they wanted to make a zine that other people contributed to. So they bound it with a string, with like a 3-hole punch and a string, and then they could send that zine out into the world, and other people would add a page and then send it on, add a page, send it on. So they had a great zine for my class during COVID. And then they wanted to, when they came back to campus, work with the CARE office, which is our resource for sexual assault on campus. And they developed a digital zine that was for people of color and I think trans students. So it was like a specific resource that they saw didn't exist in the CARE office, and they built out that digital zine. So I think students get inspired and go on and do things that like I could never even have imagined, right?
They certainly sound like important projects. And how has this momentum gone into shaping your Crossing Pride project, Jean?
Oh, yes, thank you. So Crossing Pride is a project that grew out of a graduate student here at UCI who was working, Anna Wingett, who's now Dr. Anna Wingett, who left UCI with their PhD and ended up going to Sweden and working with the Newcomers Project, so people who were LGBTQ asylum seekers and refugees. And then came back later, and we decided to do a multi-campus collaboration. So I'll just read you from like our little zine part of how we envision Crossing Pride, this project. So Crossing Pride's method of storytelling as healing invites refugees into refugee-led processes that honor and center trauma-informed refugee self-representation. So Crossing Pride aims to create safer creative spaces for countering the mandatory performances of identity for state purposes. And the vision includes performance and zine making that fosters activist archiving and community building practices and toolkits that pave the way for improved mental health practices and policy changes. So the project has brought together queer and trans migrants from Kenya, Uganda, Egypt, Palestine, Pakistan, India, Serbia, Argentina, Mexico, and those who are nationally displaced or part of a diasporic community. So with Professor Debanuj Dasgupta, who couldn't unfortunately be here today, we've been putting together a series of grants. And through those grants, we've developed a play and a performance and used both zine making and map making as tools in these conversations. But the focus was on how, as academics, can we support this group of refugees and asylum seekers to create their own tools of kind of peer-to-peer support and healing. And so I don't know if you caught it in what I read, but I think the most key element and why zines are so important to that is that when you're seeking asylum, the state mandates that you tell a certain kind of story about what your identity is. You have to kind of meet certain criteria. And that kind of enforced storytelling, while it's necessary for the sort of bureaucratic process, reproduces a lot of trauma, right, on individuals. And so offering spaces where people can reclaim their stories becomes deeply important to their own healing journey, in that process. So that's it in a nutshell, what we've been doing.
And how does the zine feature in these performances?
So we used the zines. So we did zine workshops together. And so first of all, we focused on just skill sharing, the whole idea of using zines, right? And using zines in particular as a kind of healing modality through storytelling. And so we ran these workshops, we shared that skill. And then a performance was developed out of the storytelling. So the zine making was like part of creating the storytelling. And then those narratives and so forth were turned into a play, right? More of what we think of as a traditional performance. And we created a zine that went with that performance as well. But So now, we're going to be inviting people to contribute to different, like publishing online or publishing an anthology, contribute these stories and zines. And we also did maps where people visually created kind of the story of their migration or movement on maps of their own making. So I don't know if that answers the question. I hope it did.
I wonder how you managed to negotiate the language barrier in some cases, because I imagine perhaps that not all of these asylum seekers and refugees had the same level of English.
Yeah, that's true. And also, not just that, but like if you have some asylum speakers who, if they're coming into Stockholm, which is one of our main sites, or coming into Germany in another case, they are also having to very quickly learn, languages of these host countries. So there is a lot of language barrier. And so that's, either through translation, or a lot of people do speak, learn English in these processes as well. And then some of my collaborators speak multiple languages. So that is definitely part of the navigation. What we ended up producing was an English language performance from these stories.
And are there any plans to take it beyond your own immediate location?
I don't have a solid answer to that. I think there is. I think we want to make sure that, that it takes a form that everybody is comfortable with and wants. So yeah, I think though we will definitely be producing it in different shapes and forms, whether in print or in production as well. Right now, it's just been performed on our campus and at a performance space in LA called Highways.
I suppose one question I didn't pick up on, but I might have done, would be, are there any ways in which disability is referenced in any of these experiences?
Oh gosh, that's actually a very good question. So I'm going to answer it in two ways. First of all, some of the zines that I teach with that are really have been the most kind of moving and I think important for students have been ones by people with disabilities who are writing about that experience. So that's actually one of the examples I give when I'm talking about public intimacy, because there's a very powerful zine that talks about being infantilized when you're someone who's using a wheelchair, a young person. And so she writes about always being considered sort of this angel and this child, and not being allowed to like come into her own sexuality. And then how do you do that when you also have caretakers that are sort of a part of that? And so she's very forthcoming about talking about her own experience with like, being able to, finally, find ways to access her own sexuality and her body. So I think there's a long and rich tradition of disability zines. And then actually more recently, I've been just looking at an essay by one of our collaborators where they are talking about their undocumented experience as producing forms of disabling in that experience, because of the ways in which their body becomes not only literally incarcerated, but incarcerated, sort of socially incarcerated, like locked in and not able to move. And so they make some analogies there around, using disability studies.
So it sounds like something that your students are actively thinking about quite a lot.
Yeah, I think they are. I think they're starting to anyway. And it's something that I'm learning about and teaching more of in my classes.
So if we move this conversation towards its conclusion then, Jean, how can educators bring zine making into their practice, and what advice do you have for anyone listening who's keen to get involved?
Do it. So I think it's really fun and engaging, and there's so many resources. So, you can find, YouTube videos on how, like the literal how-tos of a zine, like how to make the paper artifact. And then again, just to reiterate, there's so many great online digital archives. And then I think you'll be surprised if you just start looking locally that there are zine cultures there if you haven't seen them before. So they might happen through like independent bookstores, local bookstores, or through community groups, right? Through activism. these different channels. So one of the most fun things would probably be just to go onto one of these research. Like I have my students go onto some of the digital archives and just search the town they're from, and then kind of see what comes up, or a particular topic that you're interested in. So there's so many points of entry, I think. And then I think it's very adaptable to, like, I don't know if you use the language of like learning outcomes and so forth, but like whatever you already have existing as some of your things that you want students to take away, I think it's very easy to adapt those to the zine format, right? So like, for instance, in feminist studies, critical thinking, right? Or if you want to do, I don't know, like what are some of the kind of key concepts that you're trying to convey to students? And I think it's easy to kind of translate that into the zine project as a final project. So it's very easy to replace a final research project or a final paper with a zine, because you can have students, if you want them to do more writing, you can have them do sort of curatorial statements that go with those zines.
And if you think back to your own high school experience, Jean, is there one class where you'd have loved your teacher to have asked you to make a zine?
Oh my gosh. I think any of them, I would have been pretty happy. I mean, it's such an obvious match with something like literary studies, of course, but I think how fascinating if you would do it with science, right? Or math. And I think that could be great, So, because it just brings that, cultural context or a personal relationship to the material. I think it's a very conceptual thing. So I think if you want your students to move into some conceptual thinking, it's kind of a nice vehicle for that.
Excellent. Well, there's certainly plenty for our listeners to be thinking about as we go into the autumn term. Well, Jean, thank you very much indeed for sharing your story, your research, and your practice with us this evening. I think you've made it very clear to us all that zines remain a powerful force in the realms of education and self-expression. I mean, it's been fascinating to learn about how this medium has encouraged your students to take on even bigger projects, to involve themselves with positive action in their immediate community and the wider world. So thank you very much for your contributions tonight, and we wish you luck for the coming academic term and the projects that you will be developing in the months ahead.
I so appreciate that. And it's been a great honor and just a pleasure. And I appreciate you reaching out to me and having this conversation, and also wishing the best to all of your listeners, as we move into these new terms.
Thank you very much. It's been great talking to you, Jean.
Thank you. Take care.
Good night. And with that, we come to the end of another Sunday Late Show. I hope you found this evening's show inspiring and informative, and that some of you might even consider making your own zines, either for your own pleasure or to support the learning of your students. I can think of numerous possibilities where zines might liven up standard classroom practice. Exam revision zines, particularly current at this time, anthology zines on a specific geography project, maybe even a zine covering the artistic vision behind an as yet unknown school indie band. There's no shortage of material to be harvested from the strange world that the education system seems programmed to create every academic year. Thanks again to Dr. Jean Schapper for tonight's show, and thanks to everyone who has tuned in tonight. Do check out our other Teachers Talk radio shows this week. We have a number of new hosts continuing to make their debuts, so look up the schedule on our website and give them a listen if you can. This week and every week on Teachers Talk Radio, there is simply so much excellent content to engage with from real teachers working with real students in real schools. You can find anything you've missed of the 2,500 odd shows so far at www.ttradio.org. And if you have something you want to say or ask others, then perhaps you should consider applying to join the station as a show host. We are always on the lookout for those with current or recent experience of the classroom and other less familiar educational settings. Full details can be found on our website www.ttradio.org. That's all from me for this evening, so thank you for listening, and we will speak again in December. Goodbye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.